At 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in April, while three neighboring families loaded trucks in the dark and drove away from the rising water, 15-year-old Adrian Kessler was still out in the rain with a shovel, building a wall of dirt nobody had asked him to build. His own mother had already packed a suitcase. His father was on the phone with the insurance company, reading off a list of equipment they were prepared to lose. Adrian hadn't packed anything. He'd been outside for 6 hours straight, and he wasn't planning on stopping. If quiet defiance and the wisdom hidden in ordinary things move you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. The Kessler farm sat in the river bottomland of eastern Iowa, ground so fertile it had drawn Adrian's great-grandfather there in the 1930s, specifically because everyone else considered it too risky to farm, sitting as it did in the floodplain of a river that had a well-documented history of overflowing its banks every decade or so, when the conditions lined up badly enough. The trade-off had always been simple and well understood by every generation of the family since. Extraordinary soil in exchange for extraordinary risk, a bargain that had mostly paid off for 90 years, except for the handful of times it very much hadn't. Adrian's father, Nathan Kessler, had grown up hearing stories about the 1993 flood that had put 6 feet of water through the original farmhouse. Stories detailed enough that Nathan had never fully shaken a certain fatalism about the river. A quiet, bone-deep belief that when the water truly decided to come, there wasn't much a person could do except get out of its way and start over afterward. Adrian's mother, Priya, had married into that fatalism somewhat, respecting it without necessarily sharing it, though after 18 years on that land, she'd absorbed enough of the family's flood history to take the threat seriously herself. Adrian had one older sister, Maren, 19, away at college in Cedar Falls, and one younger brother, Toby, 10, who'd spent the evening the flood warning came in, glued to the television, watching the news with the specific dread of a kid who'd heard his parents' 1993 stories, often enough to understand exactly what was being threatened. It was Adrian's great-uncle Walt, 86, technically Nathan's great-uncle, who'd farmed that same river bottom land for over 5 decades before finally retiring, who'd first given Adrian a different way of thinking about the river entirely. Walt lived in town now, in an assisted living facility, but Adrian had visited him regularly over the past 2 years, drawn by the old man's encyclopedic memory of every flood the farm had ever weathered, and, more specifically, every time a levee or a hastily built earthen barrier had actually held. People think a flood's just water rising, and there's nothing to be done, Walt had told him once, sitting in his small room, with a photograph of the 1993 flood, pinned to a corkboard, beside his bed. That's not entirely true. Water follows the lowest path available to it. Always has, always will. If you understand exactly where that lowest path runs across a piece of ground, you can sometimes buy yourself real time, even stop it outright, without needing a single sandbag from the county. Just dirt, moved to the right place before the water gets there. The trouble that put all of this to the test arrived that April, when 3 days of unusually heavy rain upstream, combined with rapid snowmelt from a wetter-than-normal winter, pushed the river toward a crest that the National Weather Service was projecting would exceed the 1993 flood by nearly a full foot, the worst flood threat the region had seen in over 30 years. The evacuation order for the low-lying stretch of river bottomland came on Monday afternoon, giving families roughly 24 hours before the crest was expected to arrive. Nathan, hearing the projection, made the decision almost immediately that felt to him like simple realism rather than defeat. They'd move the livestock to higher ground at a cousin's farm 20 miles away, pack up what mattered most, and accept that the crop already in the ground and possibly the equipment left behind would likely be lost. The same calculation his own father had made in 1993. Adrian, listening to that conversation, went to see Walt that same evening instead of helping pack, a decision that briefly frustrated his mother until he explained where he was going and why. Walt, hearing the specifics of the property's layout that Adrian described from memory, asked a series of pointed questions about the exact elevation contours of the farm's northern boundary, a stretch of ground Adrian hadn't thought much about before, running along an old drainage ditch that separated the Kessler property from the county road. That drainage ditch was dug wrong, or at least dug for a different problem than the one you've got now, Walt said, sketching a rough diagram from memory on a napkin. Back in the 70s, county put it in to handle regular rain runoff, not floodwater. But if I remember the grading right, that ditch sits at almost the exact elevation where floodwater would naturally want to spill onto your property first, before it reaches the lower fields where the house and barn sit. You block that specific low point right where the ditch meets your fence line, you might buy yourself more protection than you'd think. Even against a flood this size, might not stop it entirely. But every foot of water you keep out matters. Here's what Adrian understood after that conversation, piecing together what Walt had described with what he found searching online that night for information on emergency berm construction and floodplain hydrology. Floodwater, like any water, followed the path of least resistance across a landscape, and on relatively flat river bottomland, that path often ran through specific, identifiable low points rather than rising uniformly everywhere at once. A properly placed earthen barrier, built high enough and positioned correctly at the actual lowest point of vulnerability, could genuinely redirect or delay significant volumes of water, a technique that emergency management agencies used at a large scale during major flood events, and that, in principle, wasn't fundamentally different when scaled down to protect a single property, provided someone understood exactly where to build it and moved fast enough to finish before the water arrived. Adrian brought the idea to his father that night, sketching out what Walt had described. Nathan's response was tired rather than dismissive, a man already mentally exhausted from a day of difficult decisions. "Adrian, we don't have the equipment or the time to build something like that properly. County's not going to send us sandbags for one property when there's families on the actual river needing them worse. I appreciate what Walt's saying, but I think we need to focus on getting the animals out and accepting what we can't control." Adrian didn't argue further. He went out to the machine shed instead, found the farm's older tractor with a front-end loader attachment, and started moving dirt from a section of high ground near the equipment shed toward the low point in the drainage ditch Walt had identified, working alone in the fading evening light. Priya found him out there an hour later and, after a brief tense conversation, made the decision to let him continue while she and Nathan focused on evacuating the livestock. A compromise that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't opposition either. Adrian worked through that first night and into Tuesday, building a rough earthen berm roughly 3 feet high across the specific 50-foot stretch of low ground Walt had identified, packing and compacting the soil as best he could with the loader bucket, occasionally getting out to check the work by eye against measurements he'd taken with a simple line level borrowed from the same toolbox he'd used, building a smaller version of the same technique the previous summer for an entirely unrelated drainage project. His first section, built too quickly in the initial hours, showed visible erosion by Tuesday morning, where water from the rising ditch had already started testing the barrier's base, small channels cutting through where the compaction hadn't been thorough enough. Adrian rebuilt that section more carefully, adding a second wider layer at the base for structural support. A fix Walt, reached by phone that morning, talked him through in detail. By Tuesday afternoon, with the crest now less than 18 hours out and most of the neighboring families already evacuated, Adrian had extended and reinforced the berm across the full vulnerable stretch, working with his father, who'd returned from delivering the last of the livestock to the cousin's farm and, seeing his son's progress, quietly picked up a second shovel without further debate about whether the effort was worth it. The river crested just after 2 a.m. on Wednesday, nearly a full foot above the 1993 flood, exactly as projected. Water spread across the low-lying bottomland throughout the county, submerging fields and, in several cases, reaching partway up the walls of homes that hadn't been elevated or protected. At the Kessler property, water reached the base of Adrian's berm sometime around 3 a.m. and, according to what the family observed in the gray morning light once it was safe to check, largely stopped there, held back by the compacted earthen barrier, exactly at the low point Walt had identified, nearly 48 hours earlier. Some water still found its way around the berm's edges and into the lowest sections of the crop fields, a real but limited loss compared to what would have happened without any barrier at all. The farmhouse, the barn, and the majority of the planted acreage stayed dry. Nathan walked the property that Wednesday morning, comparing what he saw on his own land to news reports and neighbor accounts of the widespread damage across the rest of the floodplain. Standing for a long moment at the edge of the berm, his son had built almost entirely alone over the course of 2 sleepless days. "How'd you know exactly where to put it?" he asked. "Uncle Walt knew where," Adrian said. "I just did what he told me. Fast enough to matter." Walt told the full outcome later that week, during a visit Adrian made specifically to update him. Mostly just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a piece of knowledge he'd carried for decades finally proved itself useful one more time, before it might have been lost for good. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Adrian hadn't set out to prove his father wrong about the inevitability of the river's power. He'd set out because an old man who'd spent 50 years reading that same water had told him there was a specific, understandable reason why some barriers held and others failed, and Adrian had decided that reason was worth 2 days without sleep before simply accepting a loss his family had been taught across 3 generations to expect as unavoidable. Adrian is 16 now. The berm, since reinforced properly with the county's help after word of what happened spread through the flood-affected community, has held through 2 smaller flood events since, requiring only routine maintenance each spring. He's already talked with Walt about mapping the farm's other low points in case a future flood tests the property from a different direction than this one did. Nathan has started keeping his own notes now in a notebook, much like the ones Walt always kept, writing down exactly what worked and exactly where, in case it's Toby who needs to know it someday, or a child of Toby's, decades from now, standing on the same ground the river has never fully stopped threatening. What's something someone older in your life understood that saved you from a loss you thought was unavoidable? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.